Olá a todos e a todas. Eu sou o professor Anderson Almeida da Silva. Eu trabalho na Universidade Federal do Delta do Parnaíba, no Piauí, e sou pesquisador de língua de sinais. E hoje estou muito honrado com o convite da Universidade Federal de Alagoas para moderar essa palestra do ciclo Internelis 2020. Tá? So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm switching to English now because our presenter will speak in English. And I am Anderson Almeida da Silva. I am a sign language researcher, and I work in the University Federal do Delta do Parnaíba, no Piauí, in the northeast of Brazil. So the Ciclo Internelis 2020 is an event promoted by the underdegree course of Letter Libras from Universidade Federal de Alagoas, and also with the post-graduation program in literature and linguistics, and also with a collaboration of the research group FON UFAL. So I would like to inform you that this event was made possible with the partnership between the underdegree of Letter Libras and in collaboration with researchers and institutions in Brazil and also abroad. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker, Professor Agnes Villwock. Am I speaking it right? Villwock. Professor Agnes, she has worked on the relations between the brain and the language, mainly working in the field of biological psychology and neuropsychology. Since 2007, among her topics of investigation, we can mention the issues related with crosslinguistic activation in monolingual and bilingual and unimodal and bimodal speakers. She's also interested in bilingual bimodal access to the lexicon and the questions related to the critical period and the neurolinguistics processing. Her doctoral dissertation, which is entitled Neuroplasticity in Auditory and Visual Cortices as a Result of Congenital Deafness, Visual, Tactile, and Cross-Modal Processing, was supervised by Professor Dr. Brigitte Roder and was approved in 2016 with laud of distinction for the excellence of her work. And she has also worked together, be as a researcher, a student, or as a professor, together with known linguists like Christian Hathman, Rachel Mayberry, and Jill Morford. So we are very pleased to receive you, Agnes, here. Welcome virtually to Brazil. And now the screen is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very nice introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a great series of presentations you have. And yeah, thank you so much. I wish I could be there in person, but hopefully at some other time. Okay. I can share my slides. Perfect. Okay, yeah, so let's get started. I will talk about language processing in deaf bilingual individuals, both adults and children. And I would like to present some results of studies we have conducted. And introduce some of the findings we have about how the different languages are combined, are working with each other, what the interplay between languages is. Okay, next slide, please. First of all, I'm presenting today, but of course I have wonderful collaborators on these programs and on these research projects. I would like to mention them here. So I've been working with them for a long time. So many thanks to the collaborators you see here on the slide. You saw one of them yesterday presenting, my dear colleague Christian Rathmann from Humboldt University, where I'm also located now in Berlin. And yeah, you see some of some of my other collaborators as well on the slide. So many thanks to them. A few words about the background of our research. So we have of course many research questions, but here are some of them. We are interested in how deaf bilinguals process written language. So if a deaf person reads, what is happening? What's happening in the brain? What's happening in the mental lexicon? And then connected to this, we are very interested in how deaf children become proficient in languages. So how do deaf children acquire a sign language and also the written languages? And more specifically, maybe what exactly is the relationship between reading and signing? So how are these two connected? So these are some of our questions. And of course, I'm sure many of you have encountered this more deficit-oriented theories. I would like to call them myths. So this is something which is not true. I would like to clearly state this, but unfortunately, we are still we still see these negative statements. So there are still some people who claim that the acquisition of a signed language has a negative influence or a negative impact on the acquisition of a spoken language for a deaf child. It's very interesting because no one says this about, for example, the baby signing classes for hearing children. We all know this. And this is a statement which I think really belongs to the past, but unfortunately we still see it sometimes. Same is true for this second statement I put there, which says that language or the language areas in the brain are modality specific. So some are responsible for sign languages, some are responsible for spoken languages. And while I will not present neuroscientific data today, I would also very clearly say that I don't think that this is true. And then the last point, although I think overall there has been an improvement with regard to the perspective on bilingualism, but there are still some people who claim that bilingualism is confusing for a child and that it's better to acquire one language instead of more than one language. So these are some deficit-oriented theories, and as I said, I call them myths because I don't think that they are true, but of course we have to test this. So these are the hypotheses of my talk today. As I just said, so I don't think that these deficit-oriented statements are true. I think that they are false. I think that the languages of a bilingual person are connected without being a confusion, but I do think that there's a connection between the two languages. So I don't think that the two languages are processed completely separately from each other and that there's no interaction between them. But I clearly do not think that bilingualism is resulting in any kind of confusion. Yeah, I don't think that bilingualism is negative. Instead, I do think, I showed you here this little picture of the brain. I do think that the languages are connected, but they are not confused. And importantly, our perspective is not at all coming from this deficit-oriented viewpoint. So we look at deaf individuals as bilingual readers, as so-called sign print bilinguals. Traditionally, there has been a focus on the lack of phonological awareness in deaf readers, so that deaf children might have some difficulties learning to read because they are not linking the letter and the sound. But we don't look at this way. We really think that we look at deaf people or deaf individuals who are reading and who are bilingual, and that it's really important to not focus on this phonological awareness, but to focus on the sign language they have, or the signed languages they have. And of course, we know that language backgrounds in the deaf community are very variable, so there's a high variance, and we will take that into account. And we are also interested to look at the relationship between reading and the acquisition of a signed language. We already know that the literacy development in deaf children is impacted by their sign language acquisition. There was a big study by Clark and colleagues, and my colleague Christian Radmann was a co-author on this, which investigated many children, hundreds of children in 4 different countries, including deaf children. And they found that the phonological awareness is not the problem in reading acquisition. The important and crucial factor is that children need early access to language. And deaf children need early access to language as well, of course. This echoes findings from German studies. So there was a study by my colleague Okan Kubusch, who's a professor here in Germany as well. And he found that at German schools for the deaf, children who acquired German Sign Language from birth outperformed, or acquired German Sign Language very early, outperformed their peers who did grow up without a sign language. And same findings were found in the US, for example. So the question is, how is sign language supporting reading? Of course, sign languages enable the so-called meta-linguistic understanding. That means that if you grow up with a language, in this case a sign language, it's of course easier to acquire a next language, for example, a written language, and to be taught a new language. If you imagine that a deaf child grows up without a language, then it's really hard to teach that child a written language, right? How do you teach reading and writing if there's no first language? So of course, sign languages are important to build this foundation of language knowledge and word knowledge. More specifically, we are also interested in whether sign languages support the decoding of the written words. So are signs, when you read, are signs maybe at the same time activated in your brain and in your mental lexicon? And does this maybe help you to identify the written words? We know from studies with unimodal bilinguals, so hearing bilinguals, that they activate both languages they have. So if you have a hearing bilingual who's, for example, bilingual in French and English, it's not the case that if this person speaks French, that English is completely suppressed. Instead, both languages are active. We call that cross-language activation. So we know that from hearing bilinguals. And for hearing bilinguals, here's an example for English and German. To illustrate what can happen. So how can these languages be activated at the same time? On which levels, on which linguistic levels? So the idea is really that you are not fully suppressing one language, but that it's always there. Of course, maybe not as strongly as the one you're using, but still somewhere this other language is active. And for spoken languages, this can happen on different levels. For example, if we look at English and German, this can happen on the orthographic level, so for print, so the English word Hand, H-U-N-T, and the German word Hund, H-U-N-D, look very similar. And they can activate each other because they look so similar, because they are minimal pair. For spoken languages, this can also happen on the phonological level. So the English word Hand, H-U-N-T, and the German word Hand, so hand, H-A-N-D, sound very similar. And again, they can activate each other for that reason. And then, of course, a co-activation can also happen on the semantic level. So if you have the English word dog, this will activate the German word Hund, which means dog. So for spoken languages and for the activation of two spoken languages, there are several possible levels on which a co-activation or cross-language activation can take place. Now, the interesting question is what can happen for a sign language and a spoken language? Can we maybe expect a co-activation as well? So this was our question here. And we were really interested to see if signs are activated by written language, so by orthographic forms. If that is true, so if that a sign language can be activated by reading the written form of a spoken language, then we would have a so-called cross-modal co-activation. Although the sign language and the spoken language don't share a modality, they would still activate each other. And this is what we were investigating in this study. So today I will focus on our research on American Sign Language, so ASL, and English. We ran some additional cross-linguistic studies, and I will mention them later. But for now, we look at ASL and English. The question is, if we look at a signed and a spoken language, how can we see if there's some kind of co-activation? On which linguistic levels could we test this? We could first check if we can compare prints, so orthographic forms, but we all know that there are no standardized written forms of signed languages, so this will not work. Yeah, so there's print in English, but there's no way to have a co-activation in ASL because of that. For the second column here, for phonological forms, it's not possible either because, yeah, how can you co-activate the sound of a spoken language and then the phonological parameters of a signed language? Well, they don't share the same phonology, so we cannot do that on the exact same level. What we can do is we can look at the semantics. So if we have the English word cat, this could very well activate the ASL sign for cat. Cat, yeah. And this is exactly what we did. So we did the semantic relatedness task. This is the paradigm here. We ran a very easy task, I think. We had a so-called implicit priming paradigm, and I will talk about this a bit later. And we asked if two words are semantically related. And importantly, we only presented written English. We never presented ASL. So we can see a little demonstration on the screen of how the task worked. So if you could please click the next slide, so to speak, then we will see the... Or I can just tell you what happened. So for example, you would see, so first you saw a fixation cross, just so that people could focus on the task. And then you would, for example, see the word movie, and then the second word paper. And then the question was, are these two related, yes or no? And then it was really simple, yes or no. One yes response button and one response button for no. So we presented English word pairs. There was no, and that's really important, there was no presentation of sign stimuli whatsoever, only written words. And I said that there was an implicit priming, so there was a kind of a little manipulation our participants were not aware of. And I will explain about this a bit more. So there was, of course, we designed the stimuli in a way so that we could find out whether signs would be activated by the written English words. So first, a few words about our participants. We tested deaf ASL English bilinguals, adults, in this first study. Quite young group, fluent in ASL and English. And then we had a hearing control group, who did not know any ASL or any other signed language. Okay. And now the implicit factor, so the so-called secret factor. So the participants were not aware of this. What we did is we designed these English word pairs in a way that sometimes if you would translate these word pairs, English word pairs, into ASL, the signs would have a phonological relationship. So some of the translation equivalents of these English word pairs were phonologically similar. You see this in the first example here. So the English words bird and duck, we think that what happens is that the participants translate them in their head into ASL, and this would result in the activation of bird and duck, so bird and duck, which look very similar phonologically. So some of the stimuli were designed in a way that if you translate them into ASL, the signs have a relationship as well. And some were designed in a way that there was no phonological relationship of the ASL translation equivalents. For example, bear and deer on the slide. I can quickly show the example. So if you have bear and deer, you can see that they are not, there's not a lot phonological parameters which are the same for these two signs. And this was our implicit priming paradigm. So this is how we designed the stimuli. And it took, I can tell you that it took quite a while to design the stimuli. Okay, and this resulted in 4 different conditions. I will focus now on the 2 important ones. So on the cases where the signs, if you translated the English word into ASL, were phonologically related. So remember that this task was to say whether 2 English words were related or not, semantically. So there was a yes and a no possibility. In the upper row, you see bird and duck. The English words are semantically related because bird and duck, well, it's both birds, right? So they are semantically related. And then in the lower row, you see work and worn. And those were words, English words, which were not semantically related. However, if we look at the ASL translation of these word pairs, we can see that for bird and duck and for work and worn, the signs are phonologically related. And what we thought what would happen is the following. So for the bird and duck, where the response in the experiment was yes, because they are related in meaning, semantically, and where the phonology of the ASL translation equivalents, which would hopefully, as we thought, would show up in the brain of our participants, were also related, we expected that people would be faster in responding. Because we know from studies that, so first participants, and many of you will have worked with participants, and participants want to respond with yes in experiments. So they are always faster if they can respond yes. And so the brain now gets a positive response, so to speak, twice. So semantically, bird and duck are related. And if you imagine that at the same time the signs are activated in the brain, and there's this like, oh, phonology, they look very similar. So there's also a yes, so to speak, in the brain. So there's some other similarity. We expected that this would cause participants to respond even faster. So that would be a so-called facilitation effect. It would be a faster response. For the second example here on the slide, so where you have work and worn, the English words and meaning are not related, but the ASL signs are. So you have work and worn, and the phonology is related. So what we thought would happen if the signs are activated in the brain is something that the participant sees work and warn, thinks, no, they are not related in meaning. The person wants to press no, but then at the same time, the signs are activated. And so there is some kind of information in the brain about, well, there's some similarity going on because the signs look so similar and are phonologically so similar. And so we thought that the person would have a short moment of similar, not similar, and then would make the right decision, no, because the meaning is different, I'm doing an English task, and then would respond no, but maybe more slowly if the signs were related in phonology. So that was the idea behind this. Now we can see what happened, if this was true or not. So short example again of the task, just to illustrate how easy it was. The question, are these words related in meaning? And then for bird and duck, you would say yes. And for work and warn, you would say no. So it was really, participants actually liked this task. It was not too hard. And here are the results. So I will show the results now of the adults, and I will explain what we see. This is only the deaf participants, so the group of deaf bilinguals. We expected this inhibition, so this a bit of a slower response if the English words are not related in meaning, but the signs are phonologically related. And we expected a facilitation if the English words are related in meaning and the signs are also related. And on this graph here, on the left side, you see the semantically not related word pairs. And on the right, beside it, there are the semantically related word pairs. The blue bars show if the translation of equivalents were phonologically related. So if there was a manipulation in the stimuli, so this is the blue bars are the important ones. And the gray bars show if there was no relationship between the ASL translation equivalents. So if we have a look at first the left side, so semantically not related, and we see that the blue bar, so where the ASL signs, the translation equivalents, which might be activated in the brain, are phonologically related, in fact, people responded slower. So they showed this inhibition. This is exactly what we predicted. So they had the short moment of, they knew the words are not related, but then this similar signs show up in the brain, and so they responded a bit slower. And on the other side, on the semantically related condition, so bird and duck, for example, in fact, you see that the blue bar is lower and participants responded significantly faster. So apparently this, the English words, which were related in meaning, were easy it was easy to say that they are related, but people were even faster because if they could activate at the same time phonologically related signs. So in fact, it's not the case that the languages are completely separately processed, but although we never showed ASL signs, this manipulation in the experiment had a significant effect on the response time. So here are the conclusions of the first part of this, with regard to the deaf adults. We saw that they indeed showed a cross-modal coactivation, and this activation of signs had an impact on lexical access, which means that, yeah, sometimes if for the one condition, the semantically unrelated condition, it resulted in a bit of a slower response. And for the semantically related condition, participants were faster. Now, importantly, I want to mention that this short moment of confusion and this short period of inhibition people might have experienced, this is a few I think about 200 milliseconds or 150 milliseconds on average. So it doesn't mean that there's a big confusion and people don't know how to respond. It's really, you see that only in very finely designed reaction time experiments. So it's not something you would notice if you communicate with someone. But importantly, this co-activation of language, so the simultaneous activation of two languages, also works if the languages do not share the same modality. So in fact, the English word cat would activate the ASL sign cat, even if only one of the two languages is present. And we never told the participants about this, so they didn't know. We didn't ask them, "Oh, please imagine what the sign would look like," or something. Not at all. They thought it was really just an English task. Yeah, and this is a slide too. So here are I put different replications of this experiment on this slide. So there have been several similar experiments which have been conducted, and we replicated this finding with written German and German Sign Language, DGS, and people have done it with, there were more experiments on ASL and English, but also with Mexican Sign Language and Spanish, and Hong Kong Sign Language, and all different kinds of combinations, which is great. It seems to be a really robust effect, and we are very happy that so many colleagues also were interested in this. So far, all the studies have focused on adults, so on people who have already acquired languages and where the development is over, but it's not in the developmental trajectory children show. So this is the second part of our focus right now of the work. So based on these results of the adults, we were wondering how deaf bilingual children would combine the languages, or do they experience the same, or is it different? And I will show you some of our results now. Next slide, please. Perfect, So we know that adults seem to activate signs when they read written words. And so we thought, okay, does it mean that this is automatically the case for deaf children as well? Or is this a question of development? Where can we see it? At which point in development? And so we did a quite large study, and we presented a very similar experiment to deaf middle school children. You cannot present this experiment to very small children because they have to be able to read. Otherwise, the experiment doesn't work the way we designed it. So this is why we tested children who were in middle school in the US. There are two possible hypotheses, really, if we think about children. So first, it is possible that children very early on show these connections between languages. There's some reason to believe that this could happen. So maybe the two languages are very quickly in development, are very well connected. That's the first hypothesis. The second one, which also makes sense in a way, is that maybe you need a lot of experience with the languages. So maybe you need to sign and write for at least, 20 years or maybe 10 years in order to develop this connection between the languages. This is the second hypothesis, and we investigated both. Few words about the children we tested. I think this is also important, and I will say a bit more also later. So we had a control group first of hearing children who didn't know any ASL or any other signed language. We tested 26 hearing children. And then the important group, of course, is the experimental group. We included 39 deaf children. We tested them at different schools for the deaf in the United States. So we traveled a lot recruiting participants and collecting the data. The children were between 11 and 15 years old. We tried with younger children, but the experiment was too difficult. And also, I mean, I said that the adult participants like the experiment, but it's also not for a child. It's not the most interesting and exciting thing to sit in front of a screen and say whether two words are related in meaning or not. So, but children at the age of 11 and older, they really manage very well. We tested 72 deaf children, and we could only include 39 of them. And I will explain a bit more later. And I think this is something, which I would also like to shortly address because it's important, I think. So the experiment was very similar. Of course, we adapted the vocabulary a bit because there were some English words which were not so age appropriate for children because they don't use those words in childhood, and adults might be more familiar with these words. So we made sure that all the words we presented were in the vocabulary of the children. And we asked the same question: are these two words related in meaning? We only presented written English, and we also shortened the experiment a bit for the children, but overall it went very well with testing them in this experiment. And here are the results for the deaf children and the deaf adults, because I thought it would be interesting to compare those two. I didn't include the hearing participants, but I will talk about them a bit. But I thought we can focus on the more interesting experimental groups, so the deaf bilinguals. On the left is the data of the deaf adults. You already saw this data. So we found an inhibition effect in the deaf adults and a facilitation effect, right? So slower responses if they had to say no, but the signs were related, and faster responses if they had to say yes and the signs were related. And now, of course, we were very curious to see what would happen in the children. We didn't know. And interestingly, already children at the age we tested show a co-activation. So if we look at the unrelated condition on the left for the deaf children, you see that the blue bar is a bit higher than the gray bar, but this difference is not statistically significant. I would assume that with more children, and if they get older, this is probably something which then would slowly change and it would be statistically significant. But yeah, I cannot say something about this. But you see that the blue bar is higher than the gray bar, so there seems to be something going on. But we will have to wait until they're older and see if they show the inhibition then. More importantly, they did show a strong facilitation effect. So the deaf children responded significantly faster with yes if the sign translation equivalents of the English words were related in phonology. We remember bird and duck, for example. So also the children already at this age seem to activate the signs in their mental lexicon in their brain. Although they were as well not aware of the fact that this experiment had anything to do with ASL. In fact, they thought it was like a reading quiz or reading experiment. So deaf children show an impact of the ASL phonology on the processing of the written words. And then also, and this is very interesting and was rather unexpected, the deaf children were significantly faster than the hearing children. And I didn't show the data of the hearing groups today, but I can tell you that this was true for both the deaf adults and the deaf children. And in all conditions, in all experimental conditions, the deaf bilinguals were always faster than the hearing control participants. but they didn't make more errors. So it was not the case that maybe they made more errors because they just typed, they just responded without taking care or something. No, there was no difference in the error rate, but the deaf groups were significantly faster than the hearing groups. I think that's very interesting. For the deaf adults, we expected that, but for the deaf children, we did not expect this. And of course, here you can also see, if you compare the deaf adults and the deaf children, you see that the children are slower than the adults, but this is of course normal. So of course, adults who have been reading for many years are faster in this task than children. But all deaf groups were always faster than the hearing groups. So here are some conclusions about the second study about the deaf children. Apparently the first hypothesis is true. So children start or seem to have very early connections between the languages. So in this case, between ASL signs and English written words. And then we think that also because they responded so much quicker, that there is some advantage the deaf children have. So maybe their visual attention is significantly better than the visual attention of the hearing control participants. We don't know yet what exactly causes this faster or the shorter response time, but it's that's something we will definitely investigate more in the future. Yeah, and now I want to address this fact that we tested 72 deaf children at the schools and we could only include 39 of them. So you see on this graph, we had to, so the blue part shows, the dark blue part shows the children we kept in the analysis, 39. You see that there are 4 children, so this bright blue little part of the graph, which we had to exclude for technical reasons. So, for example, I think twice the computer crashed, which unfortunately happens. Then there was some problem that the responses were not recorded, and I don't remember what the 4th case was, but this is something which happens in experiments. So this is nothing to worry about. This is unfortunate, but yeah, computers crash and stimuli are sometimes broken, or this happens. More concerning is the red part of this graph, because those were 29 children we had to exclude based on their language assessment. So these children who are in schools for the deaf, where the lessons are taking place in a bilingual setting, and where of course ASL is surrounding them all day long, all parents of these children have decided to pursue a bilingual approach and sign with the children. And still these children showed, some of them, 0 points in the ASL assessment, or very low accuracy in the experiment. But many of them did not have the expected language usage and language acquisition of ASL. And of course, if a child does not show or scores a 0 on the ASL test, we used the SRT, ASL SRT, developed by Peter Hauser and colleagues. If you want to test a bilingual co-activation of languages and there is no language foundation, then this means that the child could not be included. And same for the English. So if the English task was too hard, then of course we could not include the data. And I think this is important to show because it really shows again, so some of these children grew up without a language, and then maybe when they were, when they started school, then the parents decided to follow the bilingual approach, but during the first years of life, maybe there was no ASL input at all. And we see that this might be a consequence. So really language delay, or a delayed acquisition of language due to language deprivation is not a thing of the past. This was something we were very clearly reminded of when we did the study. And I think it's important to show. Of course, this is a psycholinguistic study, so we are interested in response time and accuracy and everything, but I think it's really important to also look at the background and the language history of those children to really get an idea where we stand and what we can do in bilingual education as well. So some implications for bilingual education, and I think there's a lot of communication needed. There's a lot of exchange of information needed, as I just said. So it's not a thing of the past that deaf children grow up without a language and without acquiring a language, and our data showed this. Although this is not something we looked for, just we happened to find this. So deaf children need to have early access to language. This is really, really important. And I think so far in the field of bilingualism research, we could focus even more, or the focus has not enough, been. I mean, there is of course research on early language acquisition, but I think we really have to focus more on the fact that the early exposure to language is absolutely crucial, and that this is still not the case for especially deaf children. And now I come back to my hypothesis from the start, just to remind you what I thought. So I thought that the deficit-oriented statements we sometimes still read are not true, and this is true. So in our data, there's nothing which points to a negative impact of sign language acquisition, in just the opposite. So it seems to be, of course, a good and supportive thing. Languages are connected, so it's not the case that spoken languages and sign languages are somehow very separately processed very separately from each other, but they are connected. So languages don't work as a single unit in the brain, but there's a connection between them. And bilingualism does not result in confusion. So it's not the case that children are confused because they're bilingual. On the opposite, it's they gain from bilingualism. If we sum up the results from the studies with deaf bilingual adults and deaf bilingual children, then we see that the co-activation of language, so this interplay between two languages, is modality independent. The brain, doesn't care, so to speak, which modality the language is, as long as it is processing linguistic input. As long as it's language, the brain will process it as language. Cross-modal co-activation can be observed in adults, but also in children, also in deaf children. This has a positive impact on lexical access. As I said, all the deaf groups were clearly faster than the hearing groups. So this is a positive impact on lexical access, and in general, a very interesting and very positive finding. So I think we can say that the languages in the brain are connected, but they are not confused. And this is true for deaf adults and deaf children as well. Of course, we have some plans for the future. I would like to go into more details when the effect is, so what's the reason for a stronger effect or an effect which is maybe a bit weaker? So what are the interesting factors about this? Right now I'm planning an EEG study here at Humboldt University. I started my position in April this year, and hopefully next year when we can go back into the lab and test participants, I will start my work with EEG, and because I would really like to understand the neural systems of this connection between the languages better. I would like to know what happens in the brain. And then we can really start to also look at different factors. So the age of language acquisition and the language environment. So what kind of impact has the daily surrounding of language on this co-activation of languages? And I would like to test, of course, deaf bilinguals, but also hearing bilinguals and children and adults, and all different kinds of groups of participants. It's a plan for the future. Now, I would really like to thank, first of all, the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I really appreciate it. I'm very grateful for this invitation. I really, thank you very much for this. I would like to thank all of my participants and also, of course, the parents of the children and the schools. And then my collaborators who I showed in the beginning. So many thanks to them. And there have been many student assistants also supporting us over the years, and I would also like to thank them. And of course, obrigada to you. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And if you have any questions you think of later or something, feel free to send me an email or contact me on Twitter, for example. Thank you very much. I think we can, your sound is,
I'm sorry, I was muted. So I want to thank Professor Agnes for this brilliant talk. We are very delighted to have you here this afternoon, and people are enjoying a lot. I can see the comments here in the chat and on YouTube. And we do have some questions, right? I would like to do some questions, maybe 4 or 5. So you can manage whether you want to be long or short in your, in your answers, right? All right. I will do the 2 first ones from Professor Ronisi, who you must know from the literature. So Professor Ronisi asks, considering the different modalities in bilingual deaf children, how this may impact in bilingual education with respect to the literacy in the written language of the respective spoken language. And then she has another one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I thank you for this question. It's a very important question, and I think it would be great if we could use the results of these studies to have an impact on education, especially with regard to literacy. I think, for example, we know now that it's not the case that written language is just processed on its own, but we know that the signs are supporting apparently the acquisition of reading, or at least the processing of written language. So I think this is something which could actually find its way into deaf education and into the classroom. I mean, I'm not the expert to tell the teachers exactly what to do. I can just provide this information and say that this is really something we should keep in mind, that it's maybe not a good idea to fully focus on the written language alone, but a bilingual setting is also really a good idea for the for the literacy development in the classroom. Thank you very much for the question.
Another question for Professor Ronisi is, would we expect false cognates with co-activation of the languages with language in different modalities, the false friends?
I think, thank you. This is a very interesting question and very fascinating. I think we might. It would be really interesting to think about a very thorough experimental design to do how we would test this. But I do think that if we manage to create stimuli which include this false friends, so to speak, false cognates, that it would be possible. So I think from the side of the brain, yes, and it would be actually really fun also to design something like this. Yeah.
May I add something? Maybe we could maybe adapt for those the test within the same modality, maybe from ASL and another sign language. So we could expect more false friends to appear within the same modality, maybe. Well,
yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Thank you. And before I go to the next question, so just to respond to this comment, because it's an excellent one, and I forgot to mention it in my talk. So of course, something we are also very interested in is now to shift the perspective back from the unimodal spoken languages or cross-modal spoken sign language. We want to go to the unimodal signed language. So to really see, because there has been barely any research on this. So, and this is something really interesting where we could, cross-linguistically see how bilinguals who are bilingual in more than one signed language are connecting those languages. And this is something we're really interested in. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reminding me of this important point. Yeah.
So Professor Jair, he asks, we know that in Brazil, most of the people have late acquisition. And also they exhibit some writing problems. Based on your studies, could we say that these two issues are implicated? So,
yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, very important point. Exactly. So I think this is the main factor we should look at. So really, the fact that an early access to language is so crucial, I think, has not been included enough in all of the studies which deal with, especially the studies which have a very deficit-oriented viewpoint on reading or literacy development in deaf children. I think they often completely ignore the factor of sign language and the factor of early language exposure. And so I think this is very, very, very important, because I think this is the key where we should focus on. Yeah, thank you. And of course, it's the same in Germany, for example, right? So it's this is why we were also, and I said that we ran our studies at really good schools for the deaf in the US, where they are in a complete bilingual setting. But still, if they did not have the early childhood experience in their homes with the families, then this already had an impact. And we can just hope that we can, change that, of course. Yeah, thank you.
Professor Umberto, he asks, which instrument or battery of tests is used to evaluate the reading proficiency?
We used for the adults, we used the comprehension part of the Woodcock-Johnson. This is like a standard test in the US. And then for the children, we used the
Johnson.
Yeah. Okay. And then for the children, we used the PIAT, so PIAT. And I'm trying to remember what PIAT stands for. I always forget it, but this is also a standard test for reading proficiency. And then for ASL, I already said we used the ASL SRT. And I also should mention that to make sure that the children really knew the words and really knew the words, we let them sign all the English words. So after the experiment was finished, we asked them to translate all the English words into ASL to make sure that they really knew the word itself. And if they didn't, then we excluded that trial from the data, because we couldn't be sure that the child really knew the word. Yeah, thank you.
One more specific question is, what results should we expect for the second hypothesis to be confirmed? Because your first hypothesis is that they start with this connection, right, with cross-modal connection. But the second hypothesis is that they may develop. This is different. So what would be the different results you should expect to this second hypothesis to be confirmed?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it would really, the second hypothesis would be confirmed if we didn't see any effect of the phonological relationship of the ASL sign. So to speak, if we remember the graphs, there would be no difference between the gray bar and the blue bar. I could imagine that even if even if there was no such co-activation of the languages, maybe the deaf children would still be faster than the hearing controlled. So I don't know about this, because they might still recognize written words faster. But yeah, this would be the second hypothesis, would have expected that there was no difference between the stimuli which had the phonologically related ASL translation equivalence and the ones which didn't. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it makes you then tell that they would develop it later.
Yeah, exactly.
That they have not.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And then probably what we would have done, then we would have tested. Yeah, okay, we tested now 11 to 15 years old, so maybe we would have tested 16 to 18 years old, and then, yeah, so we would have gone step by step, which I still think would be really interesting to do, to really follow them in development and see when the effect looks, or which characteristics the effect has, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So we are going for the last one, but not least, one more theoretical in general would be, to which extent, Agnes, you think the findings of this research that has been made on cross-linguistic comparison and has been consumed or inserted in the spoken language linguistics literature, the findings from the sign language field?
Yeah, thanks. Very good point, very important point. So I think, so my experience is that if I, for example, so from my personal experience, if I talk about this with colleagues from the field of, spoken languages linguistics, they always really are very interested about, they really think this is an interesting finding. I would hope that this would be even, more known already. And this is one reason why I also try to sometimes take this kind of result to conferences where there's not much research on sign language presented, because I think this is also, really important to do sometimes, to really go to the big bilingualism conferences, for example, and really show this, because it's, of course, for our field, for the field of sign language linguistics, it's really important. But I think it's also really important that the field of sign language linguistics is just, of course, a part of the big scientific field and equal to everyone. And so my experience is that people are very interested, but they are not knowing enough about it yet. So I hope that we change that in the future. But my experience is that really positive responses and very interested responses are occurring. Yeah.
All right, so we get to the end of our talk. Thanks, Professor Agnes, again for your talk and your availability to answer the questions from the audience and other from our colleagues, researchers. So I want to thank the audience who watched this lecture. It will be available online for those who were not able to attend it now. I want to thank as well Jair and Humberto, the organizers of the Ciclo Internelis. I want to thank Dr. Guilherme for interpreting, for his outstanding interpretation. And again, Professor Agnes. So if you want to say your final words, we are finishing this lecture.
Sure, yeah, I just can, I would like to say again, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really, glad and grateful that you're interested in our work. And I hope to stay connected in the future, and I'm looking forward to meeting in person again at some point. And thank you very much. And I hope everyone has a good winter break and enjoys some rest. And see you soon, hopefully. Thank you very much.
So good holidays to everyone. Bye-bye.